All right, another episode of the Square and Compass podcast, back with a guest I've had on a few times, and it's always a pleasure. Most worshipful brother Cameron Bailey. If nothing else, we know he's a very smart and handsome man with a name like Cameron. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, brother. Good to see you again.
So, I wanted to have you on the podcast to talk about something that I think is really important, not just your lodge per se, though I don't want to talk about that, but the idea of daylight lodges in general, because you are acting worshipful master, shall we say, of Little Falls Lodge, located in Centralia, Washington. And when I saw you post about that on social media a few months ago now, right, you mentioned that it was a daylight lodge. I've just become a member myself of a daylight lodge here in Essex County, Border Cities Lodge. And daylight lodges, I think, at least in my experience, I don't know if you've had different experiences, really do seem to be struggling a little bit. And I think that they are a very valuable and important part of the craft. So before we talk about that specifically, let's start just by talking about Little Falls Lodge, right? Tell me a bit about the lodge, kind of how you came to be kind of the acting worshipful master. And, there's a Facebook link I'll share, but some interesting maybe history of Little Falls Lodge, because you told me on our emails, right, that it's got a really unique history to it.
Yeah, so thank you very much. So Little Falls Lodge is located in a tiny community called Vader, Washington, or that's its focus now. It was started there over 100 years ago. As industry left the area, so too did everybody who lived in the area, and Vader became very badly economically distressed as the population shrunk, and especially the working population. Perhaps 20 years ago, a member of the lodge was working on the building, and it was right across the street from the local school. And he noticed that the kids were playing with a flat ball in the playground, and mentioned it to somebody at the school, and found out that's what the school could afford, right? And so the lodge bought a new ball for the school. Shortly after that, he noticed another little girl. She was walking to school every day, and every day she wore the exact same clothes for the entire school year. And of course, by the end of that year, they were pretty thin and ratty. And so he had this idea. After buying her new school clothes, the lodge, he decided that the lodge needed to provide school clothes, school supplies, and Christmas presents for all the children of the community, because it was too economically depressed for the residents to do that for their kids. And so the lodge took on that goal. And they created a unique fundraiser in order to finance it. They had and this part of the story may be legendary, I don't know. But the story is that they had a worshipful master years ago who got upset one day and was standing in the east and told the brothers that they all started having to dress better. And they came to the next meeting, and the worshipful master was wearing a tuxedo with white socks and a bad toupee. So ever since that time where they decided to raise money for the kids of their town, they hold an annual fundraiser. They call it White Socks and Wigs, where you have to dress with your white socks and with a wig, and as poorly as you possibly can. And then the Grand Masters of both Washington and the Grand Lodge of Oregon come to the event and fine you money for looking like an idiot. And of course, if you don't look like an idiot because you didn't get the memo on what you're supposed to wear that night, well, they fine you even more for that. And that raises very significant sums every year, which the lodge then uses, as I said, to make sure that every child in that community has school supplies, school clothes, and Christmas presents. So that's the history of Vader Lodge.
So on I guess we should probably get the terminology correct, because I've heard Little Falls Lodge and I've heard Vader Lodge.
Yes.
Is it actually Little Falls Lodge or Vader Lodge? Or
Yeah,
is it
sorry about that. Yeah, so it is Little Falls Lodge. The community it's traditionally located in is Vader. Yes.
Which, I mean, in fairness, a lot of small town Masonic lodges have that, right? Whatever the name of the lodge is, it tends to get named after the town, especially if it's a small enough town and it's a single lodge town. Now, the other, as I mentioned at the start, right, Little Falls Lodge, it is a daylight lodge.
Yes.
What is the, in your experience as being a most worshipful in Washington State, what is your experience with daylight lodges? I mean, how many of them do you have in Washington, just roughly? And in your travels, do you see them a lot? Are you seeing fewer and fewer, as I think I'm seeing in my travels? What's been your experience like with daylight lodges?
So we have very few in Washington. I believe that we have 3. We've got one in Seattle that is remarkably successful. One in Vancouver, Washington, not to be confused with your country, but Vancouver, Washington, quite successful. And then Little Falls, I believe, is our 3rd. Some fellows did try to start one in Tacoma, the large city south of Seattle, a few years ago, but that one never took root. So we don't have many. 2 out of the 3, I think, are quite successful, but Little Falls is currently struggling quite badly.
And I mean, that brings us maybe to yourself, right? You, as I mentioned, acting worshipful master. I think brings more to a more general point. When a lodge is struggling, which is always going to happen. There's never going to be a jurisdiction where it's just the nature of any organization, right? There's going to be good times and challenging times or struggles, right? What is it about Little Falls Lodge that made you want, whether you're voluntold or not, right? It made you want to become part of it, become active in it, and try to help kind of turn things around and make a positive impact on this lodge in particular?
Yeah, so the charity I mentioned earlier is probably the most impactful charitable program of any lodge in our state. I think it's absolutely vital to the community of Vader. But the lodge, as the town continued to shrink and consolidate into itself, and more jobs left the area, the town was not able to support the lodge anymore. To the point that the brothers decided to sell the building not too long ago, move to Centralia, which is the nearest larger town. And at that time, it was decided to turn it into a daylight lodge, because we know that we have Masons who, for whatever reason, maybe they're they're young and working at nights in a local mill or in a warehouse, or they're elderly and aren't comfortable driving at night anymore. For whatever reason, we know that we have Masons who cannot attend a Masonic lodge in the evening. And it was felt that by offering the only daylight lodge within about an hour and a half in any direction, that Little Falls could attract some of those men and remain viable into the future.
And I think that's a really good point. To me, and I'm not sure what your position on this is, right? Freemasonry really needs a variety of meeting dates, meeting times, right? I understand with small towns, it can be harder, like especially if there's no other lodges around. But if you have an area where there is a lot of lodges within, say, driving distance of each other, having one of them be a daylight lodge, just like you said, I think it provides an opportunity for brothers who are on shift work, or brothers who, for whatever reason, maybe they're not comfortable driving at night. If they're older, it gives them another opportunity and another chance to take part and be active, right? I think that's one of the benefits of a daylight lodge. So what's your experience been like since you kind of began working with Little Falls Lodge, and working to help it grow and help it make it through some of these struggles? What's your experience been like?
So just to give a full understanding, I've always been rather involved with Little Falls. It's located, or was located, about 45 minutes from my home. So I was a frequent visitor over the last 10 years or so, but always as a visitor. I've never actually become a member. When the lodge finally decided to make the move to becoming a daylight lodge, it was never advertised out to the craft that they had done so, right? And so membership, unfortunately, even after the move, continued to shrink, which results in, as you can imagine, right? So your membership gets so low that then you stop taking care of essential business. Education gets a little wonky,
Although
everything
I think,
sort of.
before we go jump on, I do want to hark back to something you just said a second ago, which I think is a really good point, and something that so many lodges forget about. Whether it's to its own membership or outside to other lodges, right? If you're making a change, if you're organizing an event, you got to advertise these things. You can't just rely on word of mouth. If you're switching to a daylight lodge, if you're organizing a barbecue, if you're organizing a wigs and white socks event, whatever it is you're doing, right? You can't just rely on word of mouth. It's so important to advertise. I think maybe because Masons don't like the term advertise, communicate if they prefer, right? It's so important to communicate these things and not just rely on word of mouth. And I think, communicate, then communicate again, then communicate again, I think is a pretty good motto that more Masons need to follow.
Yeah, unquestionably, you're right about that. And even more so than an evening lodge, if you're a daylight lodge, right? Because you mentioned that word of mouth isn't very effective. Well, it's particularly ineffective if the men you're trying to reach cannot attend an evening lodge. So they're never there to actually hear that you've started a daylight lodge, right? The only way to reach those men, I think, is through our Grand Lodge databases, right? we need to find them, and we need to contact them, whether that be email or the postal service. Somehow, if we want to attract these men who can't attend an evening lodge, we're never going to reach them by visiting lodges in our area. The only way we can reach them is directly by reaching out with the information we have in our databases.
And as a secretary, I'm going to do another plug. I always try to say this. Check your junk mail folders, Masons out there. Even if you normally get it in your inbox, the little robots at Google or Gmail or Hotmail or whatever it is have been known to redirect mail to the junk mail folder, whether it's from your secretary, from your Grand Lodge. Check your junk mail folders, because you might be getting communications that you're not aware of because it's getting sent to junk for whatever reason. So check those folders. So that's my my secretarial rant of the podcast. But yeah, communication is so important, and I think your example really illustrates it, right? You can change to a daylight lodge with all the best of intentions, and it might be the right thing to do, but if that change is not adequately communicated or even over communicated, it's not going to have the effect you want. So that's a really good point to bring up for any lodge looking at anything.
So, yeah, just to pick up where I left off, the lodge started failing pretty badly, but no one wanted to see it completely fail, right? Because it is the only charitable organization operating within the town of Vader, and it's operating extremely effectively. All of that, the White Sox and Wigs fundraisers, the charitable endeavors, they never faltered. It was just the lodge itself that faltered. And so everybody wanted to keep the lodge. And so I was asked to step in, as you say, as acting worshipful master in this jurisdiction. We call it special deputy, but I was asked to step in and see if I couldn't get the lodge turned around.
I think what you just said brings up another really interesting point, which is I've talked about as well. The danger, if you want to call it that, I call it to one thing, Freemasonry, which is when a brother, a lodge even, it could be, decides that, for them, the most important thing is X, and they focus on that, sometimes at the exclusion of some of those other important things. So, brothers have said the most important thing in Freemasonry is ritual work, but then they're not paying attention to things like the administrative side of the craft, whether it be the paying of bills or minutes, or are you communicating effectively with Grand Lodge, or are you taking care of your dues card, right? Or some brothers will say the most important thing about the craft is charity, but maybe the ritual work isn't that great, right? And everybody has, I'm no different, right? Everybody has certain aspects of the craft that they naturally are drawn to. I really like the building side of it. I really appreciate our Masonic buildings and trying to preserve them and the history and their importance to communities. But it's important that be accompanied by, concern for all the other aspects of the craft, right? And it sounds like with Little Falls, that charitable aspect, which is so incredibly important, and it sounds like that's something where Little Falls Lodge has really, really excelled in, which not only is good for that lodge, but it's good for the whole of the craft, right? When you have these charitable activities, when you're helping children buy school supplies and helping them buy recreational items, soccer balls that are actually, new. And so that's really important for the craft and for the lodge. But you want to make sure that while you're doing that, you're also making sure those other aspects, whether it be the administration or candidate retention or whatever it is, are also being looked at. And so it sounds like, as the charity kept going, which is a very important thing, some of those other things kind of started to fall away a little bit. And as a special deputy, really, it seems like what you're focusing on is bringing those other items back into the forefront.
Yeah, that's been my focus so far, was to stabilize the lodge, get its finances in order, get an officer line acting effectively, those managerial things. And then, our secondary focus needs to be communicating to brothers in the area, whom we might be a great fit for, that we exist. And the third prong of that approach, I think, is once we convince somebody to come visit our lodge, let's give them a good and compelling reason to come back, right? Because we've got to offer our men something that'll keep on bringing them back. And I think too many lodges forget that part of it as well.
No, I agree completely with all of that. And I've always tried to emphasize, right, everything's important. Everything matters. And that doesn't mean every Mason has to be the best at everything, because that's not how it works, right? But the benefit of a lodge, right, one of the great strengths of a lodge is you'll have many different brothers, many different skill sets, and you want to try to utilize them all, whether it be in the administration, the charity, creating a compelling lodge experience, ritual work, right? It's all important, and it all needs to be a focus of a lodge. So how long have you been a special deputy? I think I said at the start of this podcast, right, it's been a few months now. But how long have you been a special deputy, and just what has that experience been like? Because, I've heard many examples within my jurisdiction of Ontario and outside of it of, grand lodges sending people into positions to try to deal with any problems or strengthen a lodge or revitalize a lodge. What's your experience been like, though? Because I've never really seen it firsthand. I've only ever heard of it happening. So what's that experience been like for you?
So I think it's been about 2 months since I was asked to step into the East. Frankly, I think it was great. So the first thing I did was I talked to the remaining members of the lodge. I presented them with a plan on each step I felt the lodge needed to take in order to revitalize itself. And much to my happiness, they were all excited by the plan, willing to work it, and they've started to run with it. I think my goal is not to do the work for the men who are the members of the lodge, rather to help provide them a roadmap so that they see the work that needs to be done, right? Because if a Grand Lodge were to come in and just square things up all on its own without the buy-in of the local members, without getting them to assist, just as a dictatorial type situation, it may work. It may well work as long as Grand Lodge remains there, right? But as soon as Grand Lodge left, then every problem that plagued the lodge prior to that would just come roaring back. And so I just view my role as helping them, stabilizing them, and showing them a path between when I took over a couple of months ago and this upcoming December, when I hope to step aside for a new worshipful master.
Well, I really like the two words you said, or one, I don't know, hyphenate word, whatever. 1/2 words you just said, buy-in, right? That is so important. I think that that is something that very often gets overlooked at any level, right? Like you're a new master, or you're an old master for that matter. You're coming in as master, and you have all these plans and all these ideas, and you don't stop to think about whether or not there's buy-in from a lodge, from its membership. That's also true of building administrations. That's also true of the rights. That's also true of grand lodges, right? And I really like what you said there. It's so important. You can have the best plan in the world if you don't have the buy-in from the membership, if you don't have the buy-in from the people that you're basically working for, in a sense, you're not going to be as successful in the long term. And so that's something I've really been trying, because I've not always been the best at that myself when I'm in leadership roles, of trying to get that buy-in as opposed to just, this is what I want it to be and this is how it will be. What is your, you did talk about it, but I think it's so important, especially for people looking at going into leadership roles in the craft, the process of getting buy-in from membership. Whether, and even if you want to go back and discuss it from your time as a most worshipful, right? What is that process like? What are some of the best ways you can go about getting buy-in? And just reiterating again why it's so important to have that buy-in when you're in a leadership position.
Well, I think on a lodge level, in my opinion, and I've done this, in my own lodge when I was about to become worshipful master, and I've done it again here with Little Falls lodges, is to write down your plans, right? And then call a special meeting, not a lodge meeting, an informal meeting of all the members of the lodge. You'll be surprised. Most of them want to hear from the new worshipful master. So excuse me. So men will show up, and then just hand out copies of your plan, right? So that they can read it and fully understand it. And then stand up there and explain it to them and ask them, does this seem right to you? Does this seem right to you? Is this the direction we should take? And I think you find if you do that if you seek their feedback and their buy-in at the start, you'll get it. And once you get it, then they're always willing to help, right? And even if, I remember when I was worshipful master, we had a couple elderly members, right, who didn't really like all of my lodge plan, but they were so pleased at being asked for their feedback on it that they were willing to jump right in and help as well, right? And so you'll be surprised at the support you get, I think, or our lodge leaders would be surprised at the support they get if they just do that. Communicate the plan as clearly as possible. Show a vision for the lodge. What do we want it to look like a year from now? And ask for help.
And I think that what I always love about the podcast format, this kind of long conversation format, is the theme tends to get discovered kind of as we go, at least on the best ones, right? We started off this, and the purpose was to talk about Little Falls Lodge, which I'm happy that we're doing, and I still want to do. But I think really we're discovering a theme of the importance of communication for a lodge to be successful, to communicate with his membership, to communicate with the Grand Lodge, vice versa. And we were even at the start of this, right, communicating changes, communicating going to be a daylight lodge, right? I think if I had to pick a theme of this podcast and what was kind of emerging is the necessity of regular, even if you want to say over communicating to your membership, to lodges. I think that's really what we're discovering, because that's so important to getting buy-in, to helping lodges grow, and to making a successful lodge and just a successful Masonic experience, right? Communicate, communicate, communicate. And it seems like you, as a special deputy, as kind of an acting worshipful master, if you will, really have taken that to heart and have been working hard to communicate with your membership and with Masons in the district.
Yeah, and you mentioned a term there that I think is really important. You said over communicate, and I think we must over communicate if we want to be successful, or I should say, we must perceive ourselves to be over communicating, right? Because if we put something on social media, we tend to think that all of our followers will see it, and that's not true, right? Some very small percentage of our followers will see it. And if we send something by email, we assume everybody's gonna see it. But yeah, a lot of people don't read their emails, at least not consistently, right? Or it gets stuck, as you mentioned earlier, in a spam folder. So if we want to effectively communicate, especially through electronic means, we have to communicate so much that we feel as if we are overdoing it, because that's the only way we can get the one guy we need to see it to actually see it.
And people are just so busy now too. Like, we don't realize, or we tend to forget. For me and Freemasonry takes up 95% of my gray matter. For the average lodge member, it maybe takes up 5%, because they're work, family, day, all the things you always hear all the time, right? Like, yeah, for me, it's because I'm here all the time, I'm at the lodge all the time, I'm talking. If the average guy he's got his family, he's got his work, he's got whatever else, he's got his community commitments. We're one of 30 things that are attempting to get his attention. So yeah, he might not see the first email, but he might see the 10th, depending on what it is. People just get so busy.
Yeah, there are Masons like you and I in every jurisdiction, right? Men who spend an inordinate amount of time on Freemasonry, but yeah, we have to remember that the vast majority of Freemasons do not. It's an aspect of their lives. It's not the major aspect of their lives, and yeah, so we do well to bear that in mind.
Another theme, I think, of this conversation, or maybe it's just something that is on my mind, but it seems like you really embody this, and it's something I've been trying to embody and not doing great at, but I'm trying, because I sometimes tend to run a little bit more on the pessimistic side, but I try not to, right? I've tried to kind of create a model lately of relentless optimism, but that does seem to be something that in my conversations with you and our time in Mexico, which sounds like a start of a movie, our time, and you really seem to try to embody this idea of relentless optimism, and I think you see that with Little Falls Lodge, right? It's easy, I think, when a lodge starts to suffer for whatever reason, doesn't have to be anybody's fault. It's just, as you said, right? The town industry goes away, the town gets smaller, it doesn't have the population based, whatever the snowballing effect is, it can become very easy to grow kind of pessimistic about things. And you're one of those guys, and you see it now with your work with Little Falls Lodge, where sometimes just a little bit of optimism or relentless optimism, can go so far in improving the lodge experience and the future of the lodge, right? It seems that that's one of those things that you're bringing to Little Falls Lodge is, yes, you need a plan, you need buy-in, but you also need this sense of optimism that, right, things can turn around. And just because there's been struggles doesn't mean what the issues of yesterday don't have to be the issues of tomorrow, type of thing. And even with trips to Mexico, lodge visits there, you always seem to have this optimistic streak, which I think bodes well, certainly it's important for a most worshipful, but even for a special deputy, for a worshipful master, that optimism is a really important part of the craft.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons. I don't know if you've seen it, but I've seen it a number of times where a lodge will pick up a new and young member or two, and it can change the entire outlook of the lodge, right? Because these new guys, they haven't dealt with the struggles maybe, and they're excited, and that excitement is infectious. Ultimately, I believe that Freemasonry does have a bright future. Of course, we've been shrinking for quite a while now, but Freemasonry has always ebbed and flowed in our society. So I'm not too worried about that. But yeah, optimism is important, and pessimism will kill a lodge. I was quite familiar, because it was quite near my home, of a lodge that had nothing whatsoever fundamentally wrong with the lodge, and yet it failed, and it failed in spectacular fashion because the men who were members of the lodge were convinced that it was going to fail, right? And so that optimism works both ways in my experience. If we're pessimistic, we can kill our lodge really quick.
Self-fulfilling prophecies, right? They exist for a reason.
Yep.
So we've talked about communicating. So let's communicate some more about Little Falls Lodge, particularly what's on the agenda. When does it meet? Where does it meet? And I'm especially curious. I know it's quite the hike, but maybe I'll try to make it out. Who knows? I don't have a wig. I need to borrow one from you. But wigs and white socks, when is that taking place next? And when is all this? Just kind of what's coming up for Little Falls Lodge?
Sure. So Little Falls Lodge meets in the Centralia Masonic Temple in Centralia, Washington, on the second Saturday of every month. We have lunch at noon with the stated
Sorry,
meeting
just to jump in. Does that include the summers?
Yes. Yeah. Little Falls no longer goes dark. So yeah, we meet at noon, second Saturday in Centralia, Washington. Our upcoming meeting here in August, we're going to get a little creative. So last year I hosted a barbecue for Emmeth at my home, and the idea was that folks from Little Falls and who were visiting Little Falls that day would come to my house. We'd have a good barbecue. They'd go to lodge, and then they'd return, and we'd have barbecue dinner that night. So we're doing the same plan this month with a little variation. The barbecue was more than my yard could handle, so we're moving it out of town to a brother with a fair amount of property. So what we'll do is we'll have a light lunch at his home off the barbecues. We'll drive into Centralia. We'll open the lodge. We'll call it to refreshment, and then return out to the property for dinner. We'll do a little bit of lodge business, but mainly just have a really fun day out there, and we'll see who gets the trophies for best barbecue, and then we will return and close the lodge sometime later that night. We're having to do that because we were unable to get a dispensation to move our charter. In our Masonic code, it has to be for an emergency, and I guess I couldn't figure out how to declare that we needed to eat barbecue an emergency.
I think it's an emergency. I would give you that dispensation. Not that anybody would ever ask me about it, but I totally would support it. Barbecue is always an emergency. So I think I'm happy we got to do this podcast because I really want to support. Well, I think it's wonderful to see a lodge struggling, not then kind of continue in that spiral, but I think it's great to see the work being done to grow a lodge once again, or not to go with the far too often. I think this is just me speaking for myself, right? Far too often, going dark or amalgamating is considered the default. I think it's great to see the work being put in to grow a lodge. I think it's great to see the charitable endeavors of the lodge, and it's great to see the an optimistic approach being taken to the craft at the lodge level. So I mean, thank you for all of the work that you do, not just with Little Falls Lodge, but whether it be as a past Grand Master with Emmett, you're organizing the trips to Mexico. You're doing a lot of great work in Washington, and Little Falls Lodge is just the most recent example of it. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you, and thank you for everything you do for our craft as well. I know your contributions are extremely significant, and you're doing great work up in our neighbor to the north.
Well, I've had the chance to visit you twice, both times in Puerto Vallarta, and both are some really wonderful Masonic memories I have, but I've never had the chance yet to visit you in your home state, and that's on my list for sure. I've got yourself. I've also got some good Masonic buddies that I've met through this podcast in a university lodge. Worshipful Brother Ben Stagner, Matthew Livingston. So Washington State, Seattle, that whole area, it's on my list for sure. So maybe I'll get to see you one day in Washington. And thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.